The loss of our soldiers is tragic. 40 in Australia and many more from many overseas countries. And what is also extremely tragic is the mostly hidden cost and trauma that affects the lives and the welfare of men and women returning from war, not only the vets themselves, but their children, their families and their friends. Namely, post-traumatic stress syndrome, or PTSD, for those who are unsure what that means. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a type of anxiety disorder that affects a person's mental health. A person typically suffers from PTSD after seeing or experiencing a traumatic event where grave injury or death is involved. PTSD can be viewed as a severe illness affecting the normal function of a person's everyday life. So according to the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, post-traumatic stress disorder occurs when a person's natural flight or fight response reaction is altered or damaged. So those suffering from PTSD may feel constantly stressed or frightened long after the traumatic event has occurred and they are no longer in any form of danger. So post-traumatic stress syndrome has fairly recently come out of the closet. We mostly know about it from our Vietnam vets, but it has been regulated onto the back burner for many, many years. We have the Army claiming that they're doing a lot to help. We have had veterans speaking about the problem on SBS television and other radio stations and media, including an article in the Australian Women's Weekly about a retired Major General, John Cantwell, and his ongoing battle with PTSD, and the book he has released called Exit Wounds. So PTSD and the human cost of war, the victims of war on both sides, ours and theirs, is a subject that really needs to be on the table from the highest to the lowest participant in our society. To do just that, we have in our studio today Vince Emmanuele. Vince is a former US Marine who served 2 tours of duty in Iraq and refused to do another. Vince now organises a chapter of the Veterans for Peace and serves on the National Board of Directors, Iraq Veterans Against War, and broadcasts a program called Veterans Unplugged from Radio WIMS, Michigan in the US. Graeme Dunstan from the Peacebus, who was here for the Talisman Sabre piece, and the president of the local RSL, Wayne Carter, who is himself a victim of PTSD. Hello, Vince.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome to the studios for NAG. Vince, you've been on a tour of a 4-city tour in Australia. You've been to Melbourne, to Sydney, to Brisbane and to Rockhampton. What are you hoping to achieve?
Well, I think there's different levels we could talk about. I think on one very practical level, for the groups who are involved in organizing the meetings, I think to sort of reinvigorate and re-energize the anti-war movement here. It's not as so much what I was hoping to achieve as much as it was the organizers in each of these towns. And the organizations ranged from simply citizens who showed up who wanted to hear about American foreign policy and what the war was like in Iraq, what veterans are dealing with, but also much broader issues were discussed. What's the economic situation in the United States? What's the social economic situation there? What's the environmental crisis like in the world? And not only this, but what's happening in the United States, and how does this tie into militarism? How does militarism in a military empire that spends almost what the rest of the world spends combined on its defense, so-called defense forces, when at home, we have the highest child poverty rate in the industrialized world. We have, 400 Americans who own more wealth than 155 million Americans combined. So these are the kinds of things that I wanted to draw attention to, specifically through the talks and the interviews that I've been conducting with different folks from those cities that you named. However, for the movement and for the organizations that set up the events, I think they're interested in reinvigorating the activists. I understand there was 100,000 people who marched in Brisbane prior to the war in Iraq. I think that's quite impressive, especially for a town that size. So for me, that means, where did those 100,000 people go? Those are people who have a certain mindset, they have certain political values and principles, and I think they could be organized again. And I think that's what the organizers were interested in and are still interested in through having me come out.
Yeah, I noticed in those figures that there was only, I think, Sydney and Brisbane that was mentioned, but we had marches up here And we had marches all through Australia, all through the cities in Australia. So there was, a very active, situation where people did come out and say, well, you're not doing it in my name. And I think we all signed the not in my name, things that were going around at the time. So, yeah.
Well, we have to remember that was the first time in history that there had been worldwide protests prior to a war.
Something like 11 million, I believe, but worldwide. It's amazing, all the countries of the world that came forward, which sort of begs the question, how do we win?
Right. I think that's a serious question. That's also what we've been discussing on this trip. I mean, we've been discussing things with activists and organizers, meaning what would it take to actually stop a war? What does it take to stop institutions like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or Boeing, who are benefiting from an $800 billion a year defense bill that American taxpayers are footing every year? That's, I think, a serious question, because those kinds of institutions you just can't stop by simply protesting or signing some petitions and so forth. It's going to take, I think, the kinds of actions that other social movements and organizations used in the past. People like Martin Luther King, people like Gandhi, people who had been very successful at achieving their stated goals. And I think we can look back to those movements if we want to be serious about stopping these things in the future. What will it take? People getting their heads cracked in peacefully, sitting in, people getting arrested, people sacrificing things. This is what millions of people did, at least in the American context that I'm most familiar with. Specifically in the civil rights movement, and also the people who were protesting Vietnam. You have to remember that in 1971, there was over 40,000 members of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. There was almost a major race riot on every Marine Corps base in Vietnam. You had a situation in the American military where people in the American military were stopping. They would not fight. People that Graeme knows as well. People like Ward Riley, people like Barry Romo. Those people had a huge voice in that movement. It's not talked about a lot when we talk about how Vietnam ended and why it ended, and who is a major voice in the anti-war movement. But there were tens of thousands of veterans who were in that movement, marching, organizing in their communities, connecting with the black community, connecting with the feminist movement, connecting with the environmental movement. And there was a very robust and vibrant group of veterans who were very interested in all of these issues, including drawing attention to what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder and Agent Orange. So the idea, again, as I'm sure Wayne could explain, that the war is over for the people who fought in Vietnam, or for the people of Vietnam, over 4 million of whom are dead. And in America's context, we had 60,000 men and women who were killed in Vietnam, and over 70,000 since then who've committed suicide. So more Vietnam veterans who've killed themselves post-Vietnam than died while in Vietnam. And for those who were exposed to Agent Orange and this kind of thing, it continues today, including for the people who live there.
Wayne, do you have the figures for Australian veterans in Vietnam? Suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome and the ongoing
68,000 went over to Vietnam. That was a lot of support people as well, not so much fighting people fighting on the ground. Agent Orange was a major problem. It is still affecting a lot of Navy people today, and asbestosis as well in our ships. Getting back to the casualties, I think we lost about 506 killed, many thousands wounded. There were 6 left over there. They've since been brought back under a program called Aussie Home. Jack Thurgard, a good mate of mine, actually gotten very much involved in that. Post-Vietnam, post-traumatic stress disorder, Joy, comes in different levels. People in the Port Arthur massacre would be suffering post-traumatic stress disorder. People in the Granville train disaster would be suffering post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of women who have children in a bad situation would suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. However, with the military, and it is the fight and flight situation, it depends on how many times you have to fight or flight. An average extended tour in Vietnam was probably 12 months. I'm a little bit like Steve. I did 2, we call them tours in Vietnam. I think they call them what rotations?
We still call them tours.
Tours?
Yeah.
Well, the Australian Army...
The media refers to them as something different, like rotations
that's right.
and so forth.
Well, our Australian forces call them rotations, but in Vietnam it was a tour, which lasted for 12 months, usually February through to February the next year. However, in Afghanistan, a rotation can last 2 to 3 months. The last guy that was killed bad, a Special Forces soldier, had done 5-7 trips to East Timor, Afghanistan and Iraq. He had won a military medal for action in 2007. We in the RSL are very, very concerned about the mental health of these diggers. I guess the reason they're doing so many tours is because people who are against the war don't want to join the army for that particular reason. Getting back to Vietnam, we had conscript. I don't know, did Americans have conscript?
No.
Okay. You certainly...
during Vietnam we did.
You did in Vietnam?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, all right. Getting back to protesting, you mentioned that the protests against the Iraq war was probably the biggest in modern warfare or something. Well, I think the protests in Vietnam was quite large, particularly here in Australia. We did have the Welcome Home March in 1987, and that came about from the Welcome Home March that was put on in America. The protesting, I don't mind people protesting about anything because people power does achieve things. But however, the protest against the Vietnam War actually went to the soldiers themselves. And we in the RSL, who have advocates for pensions and all that type of stuff, it's a hell's own job trying to get these guys to come in. And I blame a lot of that on the marches. Our guys would come back from Vietnam. The day before they'd been in Vietnam, they came back by aeroplane and they're marching through the streets. And the assaults and all the crap that was thrown at these soldiers as they march has left a dent in their mental health for years and years to come, and still happening today.
No, I think we all agree with that. I certainly was in the Vietnam protests, but I think most of the people who protested were absolutely horrified.
We did worse than that to the Vietnam vets. We ignored them.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I know people that got paint thrown over them, everything.
I'd like to meet them. I'd like to hear the story.
I
believe it.
I can introduce you to a couple of guys up there who work at the museum. Look, we have forgiven all that sort of stuff. What happened because of that is we set up what we call a Vietnam Veterans Counselling Service. Okay, it happened after 1987, and it's been going ever since. It's now called the Veterans Counselling Service, Veterans and Families Counselling Service, looking after Afghanistan war veterans. The RSL was a lot to blame during the Vietnam War. The guys had come back and they weren't allowed into the RSL, Returned Services League of Australia, and that hurt a lot of RSL veterans. However, we have forgiven. We have forgiven the people of Australia. We've forgiven the RSL. Most RSL sub-branches, including state executive, are mostly all Vietnam veterans today. We're relying on the guys from Afghanistan to take over from us because our average age is around 64, 65, 66. So we're getting on a bit. We are activists in that way.
Aren't they joiners, the Afghan vets?
We are getting quite a few. Because of modern technology, everything's online now, and we have to have what they call Twitter, Facebook. You can actually join the RSL online. We're getting some 2,000 a year. Afghanistan vets joining the RSL.
Is that locally?
That's
so
Australia-wide.
Australia-wide.
Yeah. What the RSL has done to attract these young people is it doesn't cost anything as long as you're still in the service or you're in the reservists. It doesn't cost you anything each year to join the RSL.
The vets coming home don't know where to fit anymore. They don't want to get out in the public place. It's like, I don't feel comfortable. I haven't worked out my life since this, what's going on. And worse than that, it's kind of provocative. I mean, a lot of this post-traumatic stress, riding around in armoured vehicles, not knowing when you're going to be blown to bits. But, yeah? This is just provoke a PTSD episode. You want to run from this experience rather than run towards it.
Okay. Vince, you wouldn't like to see army vehicles in Anzac Day Parade. Do you know what an Anzac Day Parade is?
No, I know. I've been learning up about Anzac and... needless to say, look, here's the issue. The issue is that all of the anger, I think, is misplaced. I mean, the anger should be towards the elected officials who sent people to nonsense wars.
Absolutely, I agree.
I mean, I don't understand, this source of the PTSD is sending men and women, whether they're from Western Europe, Australia, or the United States, to what would be considered in military terms, an unwinnable war, counterinsurgency, occupying countries like the British in Malaysia, like the French in the Algiers, like everybody else in Vietnam and Korea and Afghanistan, and the Russians in Afghanistan and America and Iraq, and we can go down the list. You can't, quote-unquote, win them. The anger for me is not towards any kind of people back home and even the people who don't care because the media doesn't talk about it. I mean, I think veterans, if they really wanted to stop other veterans from having PTSD, I think they would start protesting these wars. I think they would be the first ones to step out and say, look, no, we're not going to follow the United States into another military quagmire that's going to last 13 years or 10 years. It's insane. Not to mention, we know why we're there. We know it was all BS. We know there were no weapons of mass destruction. There were no ties to Al-Qaeda. We know that we supported Saddam Hussein for 40 to 50 years. We know we supported Iran and Iraq in the 8-year war in the 1980s. We dropped tons of depleted uranium on the people of Iraq in 1991. Then throughout the 1990s, as Madeleine Albright said on Dateline TV at 10 o'clock, yes, it was well worth the 500,000 men and women and children who died because of the sanctions under Clinton. And then, of course, George Bush occupies the country in 2003. I mean, I don't think that we just have a responsibility to our brothers and sisters, which I've been working with disabled vets for 7 years now, not just with anti-war movement vets, but with the DAV, the VFW, the American Legion. I work with all of those organizations. But I've been trying to get those veterans to understand that the people we should be pissed off at are Halliburton, KBR, Blackwater, J.B. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, ExxonMobil, British Petroleum, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, all the weapons manufacturers, natural gas multinationals, oil companies. These are the people who have been making billions of dollars while our people are coming back and they can't even find a job. 1/4 of the homeless population in the United States is made up of veterans. It's 150,000 veterans who sleep homeless every night in the United States. Plus, we have 22 veterans who are killing themselves every day in the United States. Meanwhile, we have an $800 billion defense budget, but the Veterans Administration Hospital is the only federal agency that has to go before Congress every year to ask for a budget. It's absolutely insane. And yet these veterans that are coming back, they're alienated, they're isolated, they don't know what to do, they don't know how to fit back in. A lot of them are drinking, a lot of them are taking drugs, and they're like, shit, they're pissed off. I don't blame them for being pissed off. But I'm saying I think we should be pissed off at the people who have been benefiting from this. And it's not a new thing. I mean, these people have always benefited from this. I don't want to get into a debate about World War II, but what I can guarantee is that after World War II, people like my grandfather came home, and they were still fighting in the streets to develop unions in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, getting shot at by the Chicago police for trying to have a union and a steel mill. And weren't taken care of from the government, but at the same time, people like GE, people like Henry Ford, and the rest of them made billions off of that war. I mean, so outside of the political side of it, for World War II, I'm simply saying there's a bunch of what I would consider to be bastards out there who've been benefiting off of the blood of our brothers and sisters while we come back home and we're just sitting going, well, shit. Now I'm mad, but who should I be mad at? I mean, and I know a lot of vets who take it out on their families, on their friends, all the people that are close to them, their coworkers, and I'm trying to tell them, hey, look, we need to get organized, so that way we have a voice. I mean, I consider what we do in Iraq Veterans Against the War essentially trying to organize a union within the military, so military people can make decisions for themselves and they don't have to listen to generals who want to retire or want to write books or get their 4th star or political officials who want to sit on their ass in the Capitol building and continue to get elected. Those are the people who are sending us to these wars, and I say those are the people we should be taking our anger out on.
How could I not disagree with you, Vince? I mean, I agree with everything that you're saying.
Yeah, how could we not?
The core problem here is the guys that are coming back. What would happen if America and Australia and the other countries who were sort of, I hate to use this word, the war against terror, if we just if governments or whoever it is just lets these countries go. I mean, we've got a massive problem in Syria. I think that's where we're going to be after Afghanistan. If we're going to pull out of Afghanistan, hopefully in 2014, I think we'll be in Syria. I honestly believe that.
But do you think we should be in Syria?
I mean,
No, of course I don't.
The military, I don't think the military can handle that in the United States. I mean, as far as real boots on the ground outside of like JSOC, the Joint Special Forces Operations Command, Navy SEALs, Marine Recon, outside of Army Rangers or like, different CIA, death squads and so forth, or private mercenary contractors from Blackwater, which will sort of supplement the forces that you. I mean, people have been, like you say, look, we've had over 1.5 million people who have been on multiple deployments. For us to, I mean, the military brass actually right now, coincidentally in the United States, are the people who are holding us back from attacking Iran, holding us back from attacking Syria, because a lot of the military brass is saying, look, my men can't handle this anymore. They've been on multiple deployments. We've been at war in 2 different countries for the last 13 plus years. So a lot of the people in the military are actually the ones going back to Congress saying, hey, look, we can't do this. We can't do this. We're not going to be able to put boots on the ground in Syria because we don't have the kind of forces to do it. But what are we doing now? I mean, the United States is already arming rebels. And what kind of rebels? We're arming elements of al-Qaeda. So now we're arming the same elements that we then gave weapons to back in the 1980s in the Taliban so they could fight the Soviets. So, I mean, I'm glad that we don't agree that we should be messing around in Syria, because this is a long, sort of terrible tradition in the United States. I mean, look what's happening in Egypt. I mean, how did Egypt begin in 2011?
Exactly.
Because the CIA and the U.S. were propping up Mubarak with weapons and money for the last 35 years. I mean, I don't think that Australians want to continue to follow the United States down that path.
Vince, I hope the United States does go broke as far as their defence budget goes, because we seem to have an insatiable appetite for Americans. We brought you over here. You've got a base in Darwin now. They're right now. They've started an exercise Talisman Sabre on Monday. We seem to be sort of tied in so much with America. If you guys go broke and don't get there, I'm sure we're not going to follow you.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't go to Afghanistan without your equipment.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm pretty sure that if we have to have an ally, I'm glad it's America. I'm glad it's not China or Indonesia or someplace like that. I mean, I'm glad that you guys are there. Mate, we during the beer strike in Vietnam, we could only get what they call Southwark. We used to take a carton of Southwark over to your bases and get 6 cartons of your Budweiser. I reckon that was a good deal.
I just want to go back to the statement about China or Indonesia. I mean, China hasn't been overthrowing democratically elected governments throughout the world with CIA death squads for the last 70 years. China also hasn't invaded anybody, as far as I could tell, and started 2 different occupations in the last 10 years, or supporting torture campaigns around the world with black sites that are set up from Syria to Yemen to Somalia. I also don't see the Chinese drone striking people from Pakistan to Somalia to Afghanistan to Syria to Iraq to Yemen. That's not happening. So I just think that we need to be clear about who has been the problem in the world here for some time. And I think that the common narrative here that the United States is some kind of benign empire, or that we just so happen to be in this position where we have 1,000 military bases around the world. I mean, we could go back to the second highest decorated Marine in the history of the Marine Corps, and I was talking about this earlier with Graeme and Jackie, Smedley Butler, who wrote a book in the 1930s called War is a Racket. This was the second highest decorated Marine next to Chesty Puller in the history of the Marine Corps. This is a gentleman who understood right away after World War I and after serving 35 years in the Marine Corps that he considered himself a racketeer for capitalism. He called himself that outright and said that he could give Al Capone a few tips because he just operated in 3 city districts while the United States Marine Corps and Wall Street operated on 4 continents. That's from, a general who came back, reflected on his time, did a lot of research, and said, hey, look, who's benefiting from all of these wars America's fighting? I just think that there's a big mythology. I've even found it amongst the people that I've been going to these cities and doing events with, who see the United States either as A, a benign empire, or B, not as an empire, or C, even worse, as this sort of force for good in the world. I mean, you don't have to go far to ask people whether or not the United States is a force for good. I mean, you could go to Korea where 4 million people were killed. You could go to Iraq where almost 1 million are killed. You can go to Palestine. You could go to Nicaragua where we were supporting death squads. You can go to ask the people of Cuba where we've tried to assassinate their leader over 1,000 times. You can go to the people in Chile where we implemented the Pinochet regime. You could go to the people in Panama. You can go to the people in Mexico. You can go to the people in Pakistan and ask them if they like the military regime that we continue to prop up. I just don't think we have to go far to really see what the truth is and what America has been about. Outside of what Western Europeans think about America, maybe I think Australians and people in North America. But if you ask people in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, or South America, it's a much different view of what America is all about. I think the Australian people would want to ask themselves serious questions in the 21st century context of changing geopolitical situation, meaning the United States is now no longer a growing empire. The United States is a collapsing empire. That's from every economic, social, and cultural indicator you could possibly cite. The only one that was just overtaken a couple months ago, according to The Guardian, was that England is now the lowest social mobility rate in the industrialized world, and the United States is second to last in the lowest social mobility rate in the industrialized world. The highest child poverty rate in the industrialized world, the highest use of per capita use of antidepressants in the industrialized world, the largest arms sales in the industrialized world, the largest prison population in the industrialized world, the lowest spending for social programs and maternity leave in the industrialized world, and one of the highest carbon footprints in the industrialized world. I mean, that's what's happening in the United States. There's people in places like south side of Chicago, where I live, who 1/4 out of the black kids who live in those neighborhoods can't meet the minimum requirement of 1,000 calories a day, where the infant mortality rate on the south side is the same as Beirut, Lebanon. That's the same in Detroit. That's the same in parts of Cleveland and parts of Buffalo, New York, and parts of Baltimore, Maryland. That country is falling apart. I think people in Australia need to ask themselves the question, do we want to follow this development model? Do we want to follow their cultural practices with the McDonald's and the Hungry Jacks and all this nonsense? Do we want to continue to follow them and essentially be lapdogs for U.S. empire and just say, hey, every time the United States elites say jump, Australia jumps. It doesn't matter if it's Vietnam, Afghanistan, or Iraq. I don't think people in Australia want to live like that. I think the question for Australians is whether or not they want to have an independent course, a sovereign course, where they don't have an entity that's 7,000 miles from their shore telling them, hey, you have to go fight wars in the Middle East. I just think that that's a question Australians can ask themselves. I agree with you that America is the main problem, but I'm saying Australians also have a responsibility for what this country does.
America promotes itself very well with its movies and its pro-war media, which is picked up quite well in Australia. So I doubt whether Australians, or too many Australians, actually realise what's actually happening in the world and what's happening in America. So, I mean, somebody like you coming and telling us all about it, well, I'm sure there'll be a lot of, people saying, well, he's a disillusioned ex-Iraq vet and therefore, what does he know?
Yeah, I mean,
you've got to have that promotion.
Yes. Look, I think if you're interested, then you can go to the UN's website, who takes these statistics every year. I mean, unless people think the UN is part of the New World Order and they listen to Alex Jones on the radio. If they don't do that, then I'm assuming that people are interested in empirical data. I'm not interested actually so much in the anecdotal experience of coming back and talking about innocent people being shot at and the fact that prisoners were being tortured on a regular basis. All that was happening, and I've talked about it for years. People have to be able to contextualize those things. I mean, if people don't think the United States has the largest prison population, I suggest going down to your local research library and checking it. I'm just saying that, look, I'm not trying to give you some kind of a sort of ad hoc, subjective, anecdotal, this is just how bad it is. Those are empirical data. That people can look this up, and if they don't think things are bad in the United States, you don't have to go there and try and interpret this. You can look at the numbers that are released every year, and then you can go to places like Camden, New Jersey, like Pine Ridge, South Dakota, like Immokalee, Florida, Detroit, Michigan. You can go to those places and actually see what's happening. And I don't think it's the kind of thing people are going to be, from Australia at least, from what I've seen from being in your cities. It's like being in a third world country. In Chicago, you're going to have over 1,000 people murdered by the end of the year. That's just from gun violence, and that's just in Chicago. There's going to be more people murdered in Chicago this year than have died in Iraq and Afghanistan in the last 2 years. Okay, so we have to put this into a context, and people have to understand just how bad things are. because we don't talk about them that way.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, and I think that's what we need to do is talk about it around the world. The question needs to be asked.
I'll actually say that there's a lot of people who are struggling. I mean, it's very apparent here that 2008 did not affect you the same way it did my friends in Europe or the way it has affected America. Depending on what community you're talking about, yes, I would be more critical of sort of the white middle class to upper class community as opposed to African Americans and Latin Americans whose poverty rates, home foreclosure rates, access to medicine, access to health care, access to public education is all lower, extremely lower, or disproportionately represented in all of those numbers. So all I'm saying is people in America, including poor rural white people who've seen their small farms wiped out, who've seen a lot of different things taken away from them by big multinational farm companies and Monsanto and so on and so forth. These people are suffering big time. So it's not as though I don't think sometimes that they don't care, but they're simply reeling still 5 years later after the financial collapse, and they're in a really tough position. So there's times I become frustrated and I say that, Americans are apathetic, this or that, but I don't want to paint that broad brush because depending on what segment of the society, what class, what race you're discussing, it's been very tough for people for the last 5 years.
Well, I think that same goes for Australia too. I think in lots of areas, Australians have been suffering. And
Vince, I had a radio program here running for about 5 years called From the Horse's Mouth, where I was interviewing politicians and councillors. And I tell you what, you speak very well. And there's an old saying: if you can't beat them, join them. You want to get a whole heap of your mates, you'd make a great politician. Join Congress and change the damn law.
Shoot.
Yep.
I agree that there should be good elected officials, but I've been firmly implanted in the idea of being in a social movement, being with organizers. The people I look up to are people like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, people from these movements. I'm just saying that I do think there's a place for people getting elected who are good people. But for me personally, I feel like I have I have a lot more freedom in order to be able to bounce around and work with different folks. So in other words, while I was in Sydney, we were able to have lunch with some Green Party members of the Senate, the state Senate, and then also the federal, I forget what her name was, Lee Rhiannon. We had a meeting with her. We had, so we got to sit down with some folks even from the Labor Party, and this was interesting because it was a different conversation with each of these people, and I'm coming from the outside, so they know that my only agenda is an agenda where I don't get paid for my organization. I sit on their board of directors. It's an elected position. You do not get paid if you're in an elected position in IVAW. The only people we pay are our staff, our communications director, and all of our field organizers, people who are on the ground actually organizing chapters and campaigns. So they know, I think, when you're talking to people, if you don't have that sort of agenda right away where, like if you're a politician, at some point you have to throw in there like, hey, show up to vote. I can go to communities and say, hey, look, it's up to you. Here's how serious the situation is. Here's what I think you can do to change it, as people have organized for years to do. And it's up to you as a community to do it. I could help you with resources or try and connect you with people, but it's essentially up to you. I think it helps because people don't look at you as someone who's coming at them with like this personal objective, like, hey, I want to get elected, so, vote for me.
Yeah, see, this particular tour of yours has been hosted by quite a few organisations, such as Stand Fast, the Australian group of anti-war veterans, Sydney Stop the War Coalition, the Marrickville Peace Group, Just Peace Queensland, and the Independent and Peaceful Australian Network, and of course the Rockhampton Peace Convergence. So, I imagine, and maybe I can refer to you, Graeme, about those people. So are they out there at the moment sort of, doing their talking and
they are. One of for Standfast, touring Vince has been the best thing we've done in 10 years of being this frail organisation, basically a cyber net. We're not attracting. This is why I'm interested. I'll come back to this question about how do we draw the Afghan vets forth into organisation.
Yes, and the Iraqi vets.
And the Iraqi vets. I've been on this trail trying to get these soldiers to come and speak out about their conditions, what happened to them and what they want to do in the future, how's it going. Not being able to do it. I confess my failure to you, Wade. Stand Fast is not, but of this tour, right, it's brought out all these groups working together. This is what a social movement feels like. It isn't people marching down the street behind one leader saying, yeah, we're on the road for progress here. It's all these people doing best they can in their own little organisations, helping each other, joining, they're called front organisations in the old day, but having someone like Vince articulate our cause for us.
There has been more military person discharging from the Defence Force in the last 6 months than there has in the last 6 years. We haven't really looked into suicide, but we are getting suicides from Afghanistan. We know of 6 so far.
17 nationally.
Well, it very well could be, but yeah, it's out there. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a major problem, and it's going to continue on for some time. I believe the Defence Force are trying to do something about it, like getting the guys early, but the guys aren't really taking too much notice of it, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. We have probably got, in the last 12 months, 8 Afghanistan veterans who have joined the RSL. They are out there.